The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Feelings of that film, watching it in the context of today's news. 5 Easy Pieces is probably, in some ways, the archetypical midlife crisis film. And women in Hollywood at the time, like 69 and 70, who set up a production company out there and produced such films like Easy Rider and 5 Easy Pieces and The Last Movie with Dennis Hopper and films of that sort, run by a man named Bert Schneider, whose father happened to be head of Columbia Pictures, and a friend of his by the name of Bob Rafelson, who did a TV series, I don't know if you've ever seen it, called The Monkees, which, you know, right, which was a parody of the Beatles at that time, and then followed the Monkees with a film called Head in 1968, which was an extraordinary film for its time, doesn't get shown, which was a kind of Monkees film. And then started to make movies. The most significant one, of course, was the Rocky of the late 60s movie, Easy Rider, and followed by tonight's film, 5 Easy Pieces, starring, really in his most significant beginning role, Jack Nicholson, after he made such a tremendous impact in the movie Easy Rider. And he had all intentions of being in New York at this time. And unfortunately, he's been called to do his new movie, which is a film called Bob Rafelson on Bob Rafelson, which is due for release on cable network, and it's got to be done, and he canceled out. We tried to set up a hookup with video and with telephones, but we just couldn't do it in this hall. However, I spent about an hour and a half yesterday, or the day before yesterday, talking to Bob about this film, and I've written about it and studied the film myself, and I'll try to act as the puppet in terms of trying to translate some of his ideas and in response to some questions. Okay. First thing, and he told me, I mean, that he really was genuinely sorry that he couldn't make it, and this is one of the problems of paying very little to come here and making movies in California. But he told me that the film, 5 Easy Pieces, that we saw tonight, was his intention in the film, as all of the BBS productions at that time, were in some ways to go outside the studio system, to make statements about the society in which we live, using the media so that it raised enough issues so that people were able to kind of see a film like this and go away from it. That he saw it as a European film in that sense, that you try to raise people's consciousness rather than put people into an escape mode when they watch this kind of film. And the whole film was designed for that particular purpose, to make people leave audiences not cheering at the end of the film. There's no cheering, cathartic ending, but rather kind of thoughtful, in some ways very pessimistic, open-ended feeling of ambiguity, confusion, contradiction, in which the film itself is filled with. I guess the best way to do it, and because it's a way in which I think he would have wanted, and that is to try to open up the discussion for your questions, and I'll try to respond as best I can from my knowledge of the film and from Rafelson's own attitude toward this. So let's open it up. Yeah. Can you? The title, 5 Easy Pieces, is a. Let me give you his answer. This is one question I asked him. The most direct answer is that if you've done any music playing, if you've done any piano playing, you know that 5 Easy Pieces is the title of the pieces you're supposed to conquer before you get on to real serious piano playing. So that 5 Easy Pieces was, in some sense, his need to get to understand his own life, his own self, so he can get on with living it. And unless you get past that point, the rest of it is not serious or meaningful. So that the 5 Easy Pieces for Rafelson was, in some sense, this man struggling to get past those those necessary pieces that one must understand in order to go beyond it. He also, however, and these are kind of subtexts in the film, there are 5 pieces of music in the film played completely through, 2 by Mozart, 2 by Bach, 1 by Chaplin. There are also 5 folk songs through the thing, and some people have even written that there are 5, women that he has in the film, in the pieces in that sense. There's also been some reference, and he denied it, but I feel that when they took the film title, they had something to do with it, and that obviously this was a film that was made after Easy Rider, and the notion of 5 easy pieces was an attempt to try to link Nicholson not only with that film, but with that whole genre, the whole meaning of that particular thing. So these are, but primarily it was designed as a kind of the musical piece. Rafelson is himself, not only his family is not only cultured and piano playing, and he's only done that kind of work, but he's also been very much concerned with piano playing himself. Yeah. He did it with another woman who he says contributed, softened the film a lot. There was a lot more brutality and anti-feminism and hatred of women. It comes out, particularly in the last scene where he's beating her up in some way. But at that time, so it was a screenplay was a conjunction between the two of them. She was one that crew out there that started to write more meaningful, more realistic, quote, more European pieces that dealt with relationships, not with action, not with a narrative structure that sort of went from beginning, middle to end and made you feel good when you left the theater. The same with Easy Rider. If you've seen Easy Rider, you know at the end of that film, the sense of confusion. Here you have these 2 heroes you're along with, and they go along, and you relate to them, and at the end of the film, they get blown off their motorcycle. Where do you go? And what happens? In the end of the film, that Peter Fonda says, "We blew it." I mean, the whole film is about trying to go on the road to find meaning, and at the end, he says, "We blew it." Most of these films that came out of this particular studio tried to end exactly the opposite of the traditional American films, which was non-happy, non-resolved, ambiguous, conflicting. In fact, the films were, in a sense, a cold critique on the American dream. I mean, look at this film. Here he is in a relationship with a woman named Rayette. I mean, the names are really important, just like last week we saw, in Dr. Strangelove, although Terry Southern didn't want to talk about this because he felt that dealing with subtext are not what audiences are supposed to deal with. But if you saw in Dr. Strangelove, the names of the people, Buck Turgidson, Bat Guano, and all of that, which were sexual themes. In this film, this also has that kind of connotation. His name is Robert Eroica Dupree, the relationship between the symphony and his background. And her name, Rayette, was obviously a relationship to the fact that she represented everything synthetic about American culture, rayon and all that kind of connotation that relates to it. Yeah. Yeah. Breathless or Weekend? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, American directors are very reluctant to admit European influences. Rafelson was not only a student of Godard, he studied the films over and over again, he understood them, he spent time looking at these films in the context of living in Paris at that time, so that he obviously was influenced. Whether he would admit it or not, he's never admitted it in print. He's only admitted it. We were in France this summer talking in the Cannes Film Festival, and here's all the critics around, and he was still very reluctant when during a press conference when he tried to discuss Postman Always Ring Twice in terms of the influence of the French on him. But it's obvious, and it's one that American directors are very reticent about accepting. But I think that if he were here, he would deny it. No, it's Polanski. Yeah. Cul-de-sac. Goes off, yeah. Yeah. Somebody even asked whether the name Gulf was purposeful. That is because the film is about gulfs between people, you know? It's gulfs between fathers and sons, gulfs between brothers and sisters, and between relationship, and he denies that, but I don't know whether it was, I mean, I think that directors unconsciously pick things like that because it's appropriate to their particular point of view, rather than necessarily something very conscious and overt. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Nicholson, you know, if you look at the image of Nicholson as the male hero of the 70s, Nicholson, it's something in American films that that's really important to deal with, and that is that the characters get played outside of the characters in the film. We bring to this film our notion of Nicholson. Nicholson has a certain association with us from earlier films. And when he gets cast in film, people do that, same way they did with Bogart. But Nicholson's character is a character who is emotionally, has a raw nerve, sort of working on the screen there. It's a raw nerve. He's you know, that moment when you don't know whether he's making love or he's beating her up in that scene, and then he goes into the car and he just sort of just loses it and just you know, I'm sure everybody's been in those situations once where you just don't know where to address the rage, and you just blow it out in that way. And Nicholson takes with him that raw nerve, that kind, at the same time, that kind of macho-ness, that sensitivity on the one hand, and that macho-ness, which James Dean didn't have, which Brando didn't have, which the films of the 50s did not, because those films of the 50s were coming out in the early 60s. Brando and Dean in those particular films were redeemed by love. They were able to kind of come back into the fold. Nicholson never is. He's an outsider completely. You know, and so Cuckoo's Nest becomes, in some sense, the end of that. He has to be put away in some ways. He's got to be inside an institutional framework. Yeah. The question is whether Nicholson was able to come to terms with his life. Would he have been able to sort of go back in terms of the class that he came from, in terms of... Yeah. Well, I think he's out of his element completely, in the same way that everyone who grew up in that late 1960s period did not... I mean, don't forget, this is right after Kent State. This is after, which we'll see in a few weeks, Altamont. This is after the whole, the assassination of Robert Kennedy. This is when the hopes and dreams of those late 60s feelings ended up in a real depressing state where there was no alternative route. Yeah. 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 Well, I don't know if his journey in the oil fields was an attempt at acceptance as much as an attempt at escape. That is, it was an escape from that world he came from. And remember that beautiful scene where he's sitting there playing the piano, and you're going to pass by his past life. You saw the promise in it. You saw the possibility and the family growth. That was what the film was about. It's about diminished possibilities. It's about the ending of the American dream. It's about the impossibility of even having any relationships, whether it be class-connected, whether it be work-connected, whether it be love-connected. The only relationships the men and women have in this film is sex. And the sex is not feeling and emotional. It's kind of just perfunctory. And so the film is one of the most pessimistic films to come out of Hollywood at this time. I mean, it's almost like I'm a fugitive from a chain gang. You remember, if you've seen that film, when the guy's just driven to steal. Here he is driven to give up his whole personality. When he leaves his wallet, when he takes off his coat, when he looks at himself in the mirror, and when he goes and he knows how ridiculous it is, he's going to Alaska. That same place that the woman earlier in the film was talking about as this great dream and hope of openness. It's not an open ending. That last scene of that truck going down that road is so depressing. It's not a big, beautiful sunset. It isn't some kind of beautiful morning. It's a dreary, horrible day. And it was hard to clap, right? I mean, what are you going to clap for? The guy's going, there's nothing there. There's nothing left. And I think in some ways this film opens up. We did a film series on the 70s, the films would be about impotence, the film of Woody Allen's films, which were about not getting anywhere, films about total depression, apocalyptic doom, dissatisfaction. This is the kind of film that opens up that kind of feeling. The way The Graduate perhaps opened up the possibility in an earlier period, all those few years earlier, still the possibility of hope for the younger generation, of trying to find something to commit to. There's nothing he can commit to. Every area that he tried, relationships, work, family, religion, culture, is totally impossible to relate to in a meaningful way. Yeah. Talk up a little bit, yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, mm-hmm. There's a beautiful sequence. I don't know if you saw it. When they're in the caravan at the beginning of the film, and they're watching a film. The film they're watching is You Can't Take It With You, which is Frank Capra's film of the Van der Hoff family. And the film was, in some sense, the exact opposite of what this family is about. There was a kind of humanness, a kind of craziness, and a genuine feeling that the Van der Hoff family had. This family is total hypocrisy. But she doesn't realize she's horrible at piano. She doesn't even realize that she's really bad. And the hypocrisy is total throughout the film, even to the woman who's sort of like, the interesting key theme of hypocrisy to me is in that magnificent sequence in the diner. Because everybody claps. That is the scene. And, if you had to find the scene in this film, everybody was going to, go, wow, that's going to be the one, because he gets it. But I don't know if you heard what the woman said after when they got back in the car. She said, "That's great, the way you figured it all out." But he said, "I still didn't get my toast," And there was the quality that there's the hypocrisy of the film itself of making that statement, that you're really, in a sense, where do you get? What is there? What is there? There's nothing. There's nothing to hold on to. There's no meaning. And in a society that's dedicated, as Nichols said when we talked about The Graduate, to objects, to superfluous culture, to image, to intellectual bullshit, to all of that stuff, what is real? What is authentic? What's meaningful? Yeah. And Rafelson's been dealing with that in all his films. Oh, gee, I don't remember. What? King of Marvin Gardens, yeah, King of Marvin Gardens, which was the last of the BBS productions, also starring Jack Nicholson as a disc jockey in Philadelphia and Atlantic City, and he uses Atlantic City, interestingly enough, as a kind of model of the American dream of gone sour. This is the old Atlantic City. The new one just has a lot of glitter on front of it, that's all, but it's still that same American dream gone sour. If you've seen Louis Malle's new film on Atlantic City. Let's take one more question, yeah. Okay, now, that's beautiful because what happens in the films of the period right after this, and if you've read Christopher Lasch, are the films about narcissism. You go from the counterculture of the 60s, which dreamed of the possibility of some kind of redemptive community, some kind of connection with a larger than oneself, and the impossibility of that, the next step is narcissism, is self. And that's the 70s basically is the period of inward films about internal quest for self-meaning. You know, the Woody Allen films are all that same kind of journey. It's the period of psychological self-analysis. It's the period of all the movements that demand a preoccupation with self rather than community. And in some sense, this film says, yes, the next step is. We're coming at it from looking at it from 1980. We've just been through 10 years of preoccupation with self. We know that's the obvious answer. He doesn't. This is coming out of a period when the possibility of community was still possible, or at least hopeful. It was destroyed in 1969 and 1970 by all the events that totally destroyed those heroes who represented a sense of community.
Well, that was true.
Yeah.
Then we would be getting from the point of I get very much the same sense. I viewed that film in the 1960s.
Yeah.
Now, you get a totally different feeling than what you get an opportunity to look into it now because we've got different eyes.
Absolutely.
And I do get a sense of community, not from him, but I do get definitely a sense of community.
Yeah, but a sense of shared alienation.
And I also don't get total lack of hope. I have a lot of feeling of desperation in that individual and as how he sees it. But I can't force myself to feel the way I would have felt if I was watching this film.
I don't know, how many people feel there's the sense of, that sense of hope, or that's anything in this? Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, I see that the families, that would be the father's attitude toward him. That would be, you poor guy, look what you did. You had a college education, you had 10 years of piano training, and what do? You throw it away in the oil fields, What? Yeah, what, yeah? But I think that, no, I'm talking about the inappropriateness of the world around him. For him, yes, for him, and for the people at that time who no longer bought the idea that success is being on the stage, that success is having a good job, family, children, all the things which he turned away from.
Did they also feel that work in the sense of achievement was not worthwhile? You see, 5 Easy Pieces to me suggests that you have to work through the vocabulary or wherever you're going. And once you reach that, you can move ahead to have the gravy. That's what the suggestion. I don't see what in the film is holding what outside of him in the film is holding him back from that society is doing this. Comes across to me, and I tend to think in social terms, comes across to me as a picture of an inept, immature youngster who has never grown up. I hate to be self-simplistic.
Yeah. Can you? I mean, if you, somebody, we were talking about this, Rafelson, somebody suggested this film has a correlation with the Odyssey, that's searching for real meaning. And there's an Odyssey here, there's a journey here that he's taking. The fact that he doesn't find anything to relate to along the way is in some sense a very important indictment in the context of this film of the period in which he's living, in which Nicholson and Rafelson are making the film. To us, and that was what the 60s was about. The 60s was about the counterculture saying the dreams of American society, everything that we've been taught, literally does not deliver anymore. If it doesn't deliver, then what does? Ideals were fictions. They were emptiness. The 60s said that the ideals and the goals of the 60s was that it turned to shit. You looked at it, and what was it about? The enemy was across the breakfast table. It was the parents who grew up in the 50s who had the American dream, who had everything they wanted. And the children of the 60s looked at the parents and said, what for?
All the demonstrations after Kent State.
Yeah.
All the fervor that were at the end of the 60s, it seems to me, the picture does not give any of that for him to relate to. I mean, it doesn't say the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
How can I say it?
What do you want him to do? Do you want him to go back on the stage? Do you want him to go and have a child with Rayette and live? But in the context of the 1970s, where was protest? Gunned down at Kent State, assassinated Los Angeles. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. I'm not arguing with that. Yeah. Yeah. Talk up. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Dean gets back. No one's arguing that the way he dealt with the world was escape. He has, at the end, the last thing he's escaping is escaping to Alaska. But in the context, we're talking again in the context of when this film was made, that was in some sense as best that people could do in the in terms of what was a possibility at the time. We're talking about a society of diminished possibilities. We're talking a society that was driven to its own self-analysis, a society that was driven to its own narcissistic belief systems, a society which was inside themselves. Sure, the generation of the 70s turned everything around to try to work through all sorts of ways to try to find the self so you can get on to the next part of your life. But the question was raised in this film about the past as being the alternative, the structure of marriage, the structure of culture. All of that was no longer the possibility. All right, we said last question. This is the last comment. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it's all right. Fine. I mean, the purpose of the film is to raise these things in this series. Next week, we'll have the producers a study of Reagan economics, where success is failure and failure is success. So we'll talk about that. Yeah. I think so. Yes, we will.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.